Do you have an interview, like an interrogation room at this police department?
Mm-hmm. You should come do a tour sometime.
And,
It's a lot smaller than you probably think it is, our department as a whole. So our interview room is, I don't know, like a 6x8 room, maybe 8x10, small room. So
well, cramped quarters.
we like to call it interview, not interrogation.
Yeah.
It's a softer term. So
You have a jail over there, don't you? You have a.
Mm-mm.
I thought for.
it's rare nowadays for police departments to have jails. There's not many left in the state of Michigan, and most sheriff's departments have jails. That's one of the obligations of a sheriff's department is to have the jail.
Have the jail.
So, to be honest with you, I wouldn't want the headache of a jail, trying to staff it and things like that. Now, I just got a tour last week, I believe in the 1960s. I know Chief Horncoal was the chief. The jail was in the courthouse. The courthouse is now. And the sheriff then used to live in the jail. He and his wife used to live in the jail, which is kind of a neat story.
Yeah.
But I talked to Bob Horncoal, who's a retired public safety director, and that jail was active when he was an officer. And sure enough, the sheriff used to live at the jail with his wife, and there weren't many cells, it doesn't look like. Now that's converted to, I think, storage, and it's the probation parole office at the courthouse. But yeah, we don't have a jail. I don't know that the city has ever had a jail.
For some reason, in my mind, I thought that there was like a one cell, like it's like a Western in my head, like you guys are sitting with your feet up on the desk, and there's somebody sitting in the cell, and you're like, shut up in there.
Well, I can tell you that cell that I saw at the courthouse wasn't too far off from that. I only saw the one cell. It wasn't the bars, but it was
That's
just,
what I would love to see.
it's just interesting how things were, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and how policing has changed and how it continues to change, and it's always going to be changing. And from a leadership perspective, is you have to be flexible and be able to change with the needs. I use the analogy, things that are too rigid tend to break. And so you can have your principles and have your vision, but you also have to be flexible and be able to adapt with the times. So I think that's important, especially now. I mean, reality is in law enforcement, every 5-10 years there's major changes, whether it be staffing levels and legislation, case law, tools, techniques. There's always going to be change, and you have to be prepared for that change and try to do your best to see on the horizon to anticipate that change, because it's coming, whether you want it to or not.
Sure.
It's coming. So do the best you can for yourself and the organization and the people who work with you to absorb that change and to change with it. So to provide professional policing.
Walk me through how you became a police officer. I mean, what's the story behind Police Chief Josh Glass becoming chief of police?
Well, early on, as a kid, I remember wanting to be a police officer, and this is going to sound incredibly cheesy.
Sure.
But
I wanted to be a cowboy.
Here we go. No. Here we go. When I was young, watching the TV show Cops, and just seeing the different environments that police officers were in, it seemed like it's every night is something different, and the police officer does so many different things, from helping people, arresting people, but it seemed like the environment they worked, their work day was constantly changing, and it wasn't doing the same thing over and over. And I think that was a big draw for me, for whatever. You can't do this job if you don't have a desire, an honest desire to serve and to help. So that's always there, but it was the environment and the problem solving aspect of it that really drew it to me, or drew me to it. Wanting to solve these problems, whether it be a traffic stop or an arrest, it appealed to me. And being a kid involved in team sports, being part of a team was important, and it just kind of fit. But I always tell people, the interview answer is, well, why do you want to be a police officer? Well, I want to help people. that's a given. You cannot last in this profession unless you truly want to help people and want to serve. Um, but above and beyond that was just the problem-solving aspect. This career allows. You're not going to get rich being a police officer, but you can look at the people you help, the lives you've affected, and that's kind of your reward, so to speak, is how you've had a positive impact on people's lives. So that's, I want to say back when I was a teenager, I looked to law enforcement, as far back as then. So
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the city of Muskegon. As a young person, we moved here going further back. We moved here from out of state when I was, I think, 7, 8, or 9. Moved to Muskegon. I went to high school at Orchardview High School.
Yeah.
I know.
Ugh.
Go Cards. And, as a kid in high school, I was a 3-sport athlete. I played sports for some tremendous coaches.
I mean, Orchardview is a pretty solid athletic program there.
Yeah. And so after high school, I was involved in high school sports and solid academically. I went to Grand Valley State. Had a brief relationship with college football. It's a brief relationship. I played a year and a half of college football, and then attended the police academy there. And after the police academy, there were not enough jobs for applicants. It's a complete change.
Yeah, I was going to say now it's like.
Flip-flop. I remember going to Grand Rapids Police Department interviewing as a young kid at 23 years old, and being in a room with probably 1,000 applicants, and that was one of multiple sessions of testing, and so it was a different time. So anyways, ended up at Manistee in 2004. One of the things that I was very fortunate to do as a young person in college was, after college football, I got involved in coaching.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that. Yeah.
And so one of my old football coaches, here I am, this college kid, and college football didn't work out, and so asked me if I wanted to come coach football for him, a JV football at Orchardview, and I thought, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So my brother and I and another individual we played with coached football. And at first, it was just, hey, go to class, come back and coach football. It's something we know, it keeps us busy, but it became more than that. It really became my first lesson in leadership. It became my first lesson in people depending on you for something, the want to perform, the obligation. I loved it. I was a 19-year-old college kid with really no obligations, coaching football, having a great time with my brother, and I was coaching under the coaching staff that coached me as a kid in high school. John Shillito, who now is a legendary coach in the state of Michigan, to coach underneath him was great. And never wavered off my wanting to be law enforcement. My brother and my sister, they're both teachers. And my brother, his path was teaching and football and teaching coaching path. But even though I fell in love with coaching, I never wavered off the law enforcement path. I just, and so I coached there up until the year I was hired here in 2004. In 2004, I talked to the police chief was Dave Bachman. And I explained to him that, I had coached football, and he loved having a police officer involved in the community and coaching football, so he kind of hooked me up with a potential path to coaching locally. And as I was driving around in 2004 looking for a place to live, I remember seeing a coaching friend of mine from the Michigan Coaching Association, Gus Kapolka. And Gus Kapolka had coached at Boyne City. And so I drove around. I stopped and said, what are you doing here? And he said, they had a coaching job at the varsity, varsity football coaching job. And I said, really? He said, what are you doing here? I said, I just got a police officer job here. And so the two of us knew each other through the Coaches Association, and it kind of clicked. And so he asked me to coach with him, and I did. And it was just happenstance that we both got hired the same year, and yeah, it was great. I coached for 6 or 7 years here until 2011. In 2011, I was assigned to an undercover narcotics task force, which didn't allow me to really be in the public eye too much.
Yep.
So that was a difficult decision, but an important one for my career. But it was great. I think that coaching football really taught me the importance of interaction with our young people. It kind of plugged me into them. And so now as a police chief in Manistee, I understand that importance, and I encourage our officers to be involved with our young people and be involved within the schools. And I think that's definitely given me that perspective that maybe if I didn't coach football or high school sports, I wouldn't have that perspective per se. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity I had as a young person to be able to coach football at a high school level for 13 years. Ups and downs, and I think it's really prepared me for my position. Oddly, I didn't know at the time, but oddly enough, it prepared. Coaching high school football, and those who have coached or anything at a certain level, you find the highs are never higher and the lows are never lower.
Yeah.
And you got to find that even keel, somewhere in between, just to keep you level, for the sake of the people you coach and your staff and things. So it was a great experience, and I'm very thankful for it. I get a phone call every year to coach from my friends back in Muskegon, and I don't know that's in the cards for me. But
I was just going to ask you if you ever thought about going back. I mean, it's probably got to be a lot more difficult time-wise.
It's hard. It's hard to make that commitment, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a person that would be a show-up coach or a part-time coach. I'm kind of an all-in person. So, it doesn't look like it's in the cards. I wouldn't be able to commit to that level of commitment. But again, you never say never. My kids are young, so who knows what's in the cards. But right now, this year, today, I can't make that level of commitment.
Right.
That time is elsewhere.
So we become chief of police. Now, how's that move from you've been in narcotics for a little while or undercover, and then I don't ever remember seeing you in a squad car. But
It's
then
been a
again,
while.
you never pulled me over.
Right.
But
It's been a while. So, yeah, my path was, in 2004, hired as a police officer. And then I was a patrol officer. And then in 2011, I was assigned to the drug team. And that's actually where I met our now Sheriff Katowski, and he and I worked on that team together for a few years. And in 2015, our detective, John Riley, retired. And
Yep.
I was fortunate to obtain that position through a promotional process. And so from 2015 up until 2020, I was a department detective sergeant. So
you weren't even in the car that long.
well, 7 years, 6.5, 7 years. But no, the majority of my time has been spent as an investigator. Over 10 years of my career, well, about 10 years, have been spent as an investigator, as a detective, either whether it be drugs or drug-related crimes to major crimes as a detective sergeant. So, and I was fortunate in that role to have a number of things occur that at the time I didn't think I was fortunate, but gave me experience and perspective into my now position. So,
Was that a difficult leap, a difficult interview, jumping to chief of police?
it's different. So, as I found out early on, you had to kind of get rid of your detective gear, because when you have a major scene and you show up as a chief, it's really easy to go into detective mode, because that's what I spent almost half my career doing. So it's important that I recognize that's not my function or role. And again, this is 2020, so now 2 or 3 years removed from that, I'm a lot better at that. But I really appreciate that experience. I always talk about, I tell our supervisors, when you're an officer and you're dealing with something, you're dealing with it head on. You're the person talking to the complainant, the victim, the suspect. You're right here. And I ask our supervisors to step back and see the bigger picture, so they can see things a little more clearly, a bigger picture, And then as the police chief, the obligation is to see the whole picture. So that's kind of the quick way that I explain it to our staff. Yeah, and so instead of being part of the team, you're really in charge of the team, and that's everything. That's hiring, firing, recruiting, developing, leading, setting the vision for the organization, setting priorities. It's really everything. Now, so again, it's been a great experience. You know, I was promoted chief during COVID,
Yeah,
which was an interesting time.
I bet.
So right out of the gate, it was very challenging. And to be honest with you, that's kind of how my whole career has gone. It's trial by fire. I've never had time to ease into anything or smooth anything. And looking back now, that's probably the best way.
Was it pretty quiet during COVID, especially during the lockdown?
Quiet from a complaint standpoint. Our complaints and
Crime.
911 calls kind of went down, but you had other concerns, right? You had staffing shortages and contingency schedules and staying in tune to health department regulations, both internally and externally, and it was completely different. And so again, that flexibility we talked about, you can't just put your hands there and go, oh, I don't know what to do. No, you're expected to have the answers. So it was interesting as our then public safety director, Tim Kozal, tasked me as a detective sergeant with coming up with a schedule for COVID, knowing that, you know, then the regulations is you can't have employees too close. We had to change everything we did. We changed everything. And unfortunately, the day that I got the schedule complete and turned it into him is the day that I got sick. And so I was home for a while with COVID. But, you know, going back to the point of being flexible, we had to change everything.
Yeah.
You know, you have to be careful with your comfort level. You really can't have much of a comfort level. It's a moving target. So as far as keeping employees away from each other all the time and changing and unchanging and who's in the cars and, you know, what happens if we have exposure, it was constantly, a lot of energy was focused on that. It was focused on the day-to-day operations thing. So yeah, it was interesting.
Can you walk us through what it's like a shift, say a shift for one of your patrolmen, for one of your officers, start to finish? What that kind of looks like?
I think I can. It's been a while since I've been in the car, but no. So like a day shift?
Yeah.
Let's talk about a day shift. So the expectation is that our day shift works from 7A to 7P. There's a little bit of time with the night shift where they get briefed on anything that happened to the night. They get whatever administrative things they need to do, check out all the equipment, check the car, load the car, and the expectation is they're in the school zones. If we don't have calls for service, I want them in the school zones, creating a presence, deterring speeders, anything like that. I want them visible, most importantly. And so from there, day shift, depending on what time of year is, if we have time to work traffic enforcement, you know, in the summertime, our calls for service go up substantially, so we don't have a lot of time for things like traffic enforcement or sometimes we work on blight enforcement. That's been a big issue recent years, and when the officers have downtime between taking calls for service, working on reports, conducting follow-up, doing all the mandatory things we ask them to do, that self-initiative time, meaning that they can spend that time how they choose as far as enforcement. Most of that goes to blight enforcement.
Yeah, what a pain in the ass.
Well, it's something that has been made a priority for officers. I think they do a great job with it. You know, there are so many things that contribute to blight, and I think you really have to be a police officer on the ground level to interact with folks in town here to realize that there's no two cases, you know,
Right.
this person has this situation going on in their house because of A, B, and C, but this person could be X, Y, Z. So our officers are very patient, but that has been a major task is enforcing blight and really working with property owners to resolve the blight. You know, if someone has an issue with blight because of their economic depression, you know, writing a citation is not going to remedy
Yeah,
that.
it's not going to help them. Yeah.
So
Clean
our
it up.
officers are very patient. Sometimes they're more patient than I'd like them to be. But again, our officers are committed and involved in the community. So I think they do a great job every year. We reevaluate and what can we do better. And there's been other resources that we've collaborated with to that end. But anyways, that's self-initiated time.
Yeah.
Usually it's geared mostly towards blight, some traffic enforcement, taking calls for service, conducting follow-up investigations. In the summertime, we expect them, if they have time, to conduct foot beats downtown, Riverwalk, the beaches. We really promote positive interactions, not just with our young people, but just positive interactions overall. I love it when they take the Polaris down to the beach.
Yeah, I did.
Well, and they use that as a conversation piece to interact with the public.
Mm-hmm.
We have officers assigned to each school as liaisons.
I was just going to ask you that. They're still doing that.
So we encourage them to pop in and have, again, not just show up when someone calls you, but just pop in the school, check in with the kids, the staff, have positive interactions with students, and create presence and foot beats. And that's usually that. Our calls for service keep us pretty busy. They seem to every year rise. Post 2020, I think we were up 500 calls from last year.
That's a lot for a little town like this, right?
It's a noticeable increase. We have, and I report tomorrow night on my annual report to City Council, our stats, but if I have the number right, I think we're just shy of 6,000 calls for service. That's the calls for service is when someone calls 911 and asks whatever it might be. So I kind of use that as a gauge for what is asked of our officers and how busy they are. But it is school zones, being involved in the schools, traffic enforcement, calls for service, and calls for service. The expectation is, as a previous detective, is that we are doing everything we can to solve crimes. We aren't just taking a report and have it on file. I think the officers over the last few years have done a great job with that. And then all the things that are pulling on our proactive time, finding out what's best suited for that. So I'm not sure that answers your question.
Yeah,
The beautiful thing about being on a shift is one phone call could change everything. I remember as a detective, I told our now detective, Kirsten Goodsby, I said, you need to be ready because one phone call could change your day, your week, and sometimes your month. You got to be ready, again, going back to being flexible. You got to be ready to pivot and move. And, you thought you were doing this today, but you got a phone call. Maybe we have a major crime we have to move on.
What's a major crime? Murder?
Major crime would be a significant sexual assault, a significant breaking entering, murder, a violent crime, and then you have other things like a vehicle going into the channel, someone falling off the pier. Those are things that require a lot of resources. So those were,
Dude, that vehicle going in the channel that was 2 years ago now, wasn't it?
I think it was November of, I think it was 21.
In the heat of it, in COVID, jeez.
Yeah, it was challenging, but again, in an issue like that or a situation like that, you had city, county, tribal police departments. You have the Coast Guard. I requested dive teams from our Manistee County dive team, Grand Traverse, and there's one other that I'm forgetting. So it requires a lot of resources, and specifically for that incident, you had a couple of things. You had a recovery operation going on in the water, and you had an investigation operation at the same time. So, again, trying to solve the problem in the water, but also trying to figure out the why, and those things need to happen at the same time. So,
Right.
Again, one 911 phone call, your day is different, your week is different, and we have to be ready to provide that service. It's important.
So calls gone up. I've been going up, and I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, well, we were talking about the some of the break-ins and stuff that have been happening around town, and I said, well, when summer comes, a lot of that stuff's probably going to stop because there's more people, businesses are open later, there's more bodies moving around. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the calls are more not for crime, but emergency, like medical emergencies and stuff, or am I way off?
Our calls go up. I mean, our calls for service go up significantly in summertime. And really, generally speaking, September, October to March, April is usually when the calls start dropping.
Okay.
That's usually, but they go up significantly, and sometimes, depending on staffing levels, we talked about self-initiated times where the officers can run traffic, or sometimes you don't have a lot of that in the day because of the need and the calls for service. And again, the most important thing is, especially in summertime, where's our population? It's downtown, the river walks, at the beaches.
Right.
I want our officers there interacting. And again, it's yes, it's a deterrent factor, but I want interactions with the public and the police, positive interactions. So
Are you stretched too thin?
I don't think we're stretched too thin. Again, staffing is always an issue. And when I mean staffing, I mean getting staff. So it's not like it was back when I was a young person. You have to be super competitive in this market. People just aren't going into this field. And so we have to find a way to attract those employees. And it's not just law enforcement. We're seeing it in public service across the board, firefighters, paramedics. So we have to find a way to attract candidates, to recruit, retain them. It's a challenge.
You got to pay them more. I know that's not you, but I mean, when I look at the line of work that you're in, fire department, EMT, any of that stuff that's high level, we're trying to save lives.
Yeah.
I mean, the benefits package got to get a little bit higher. It's just like teachers. I mean, it seems like it's just like it's a little bit too low for what you're asking.
Well, and again, some of it's learning your audience. So, and I've said this before that our pension program at the city for officers is still a really good pension program. But something I didn't anticipate is necessarily young candidates, 21, 22, 23, pension not necessarily a priority for them.
Yeah, I get
You
it.
start talking about pension, and even though we have a very competitive pension at the police department, that's not a priority for them. So where you think is something that's attractive isn't so attractive. So that's upon me to find out what candidates are looking for and kind of, again, be flexible and try to find a way to pull them in. And then once they get here, keep them here.
So we could circle back to the break-ins. I know we can't talk about ongoing investigations or anything like that, but I did have one question. I think I read in the paper, I saw it on Facebook, that curfew's been put in place for...
Well, curfew hasn't been put in place.
Okay.
There's
See, I'm glad I brought it
There's always
up.
been a state curfew. There's a state curfew that dictates.
Is there really? See, I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
So,
For me?
and we've always tried to enforce. No. And I couldn't read it right offhand, but for juveniles in the state of Michigan, and that's just something we focused on. And I think it was taken where the police chief was
we're
going to
dropping the hammer.
Yes, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. But understanding, we have to look at these things. Okay, so first of all, we're talking about local breaking enterings recently. I'm very proud of our police department and their ability to solve almost all of them.
Yep.
Very proud of that fact. And that's led by the officers and our detective sergeant. But just understanding when these are happening, what are the circumstances, obviously involving juveniles, and, without getting into too much, juvenile detention is different than adult detention. So when someone who is 18 or older breaks the law, you find probable cause to arrest them, you can arrest them and take them to jail. And then their due process starts.
Sure.
With the juvenile, in order to detain them, so incarcerate them or anything, the prosecutor's office has to request an emergency hearing in front of the judge. They have to present the case to the judge. The judge has to order them to a detention facility, and most importantly, there has to be a detention facility available. And what we're finding is, just like mental health, a shortage of these facilities. Now, to be clear, I don't think that juvenile delinquents should all be locked up.
Sure. I agree with that statement.
That is when you get to that point, you've kind of lost.
Yep.
But
Agreed.
with that said, there are those times when a juvenile is either committing multiple offenses consecutively, or they are significantly violent, where the services that our juvenile justice system is designed to provide that juvenile, they need to receive those in a detention facility where they can't hide from those services. They can be, I don't want to use the word treated because it sounds medical, but
Sure.
they can provide those services in a contained environment. So again, the frustrating part is the perception is the lack of accountability, because how can this happen? In the adult world, you have consequences. At least you go to jail maybe for a night or even longer. And so that's why it's so important, the prosecutor's office and the juvenile probation, we continuously work together to strategize how can we provide better services. And again, this is not a Manistee County problem.
Yeah, I know.
Talking to other chiefs in the state of Michigan, this is a statewide problem. But going back to the status offenses or the curfew, is that if we have a 14-year-old kid, a 13-year-old kid out running the streets at 3 o'clock in the morning,
dude.
they need to be brought home so their parents are made aware of it, and we're going to file a criminal complaint with the prosecutor, so that, number one, the parents are made aware of it. Number two, if it continues, there's some accountability. There has to be some accountability. We're not going to be a town where kids are running around all hours of the night lawless. That's plain and simple. Now, the strategies to get there might differ, but it's just not going to happen. So it's important that, if a kid sneaks out, our officers make contact with them. We take them home, make the parents aware, and we send a report to the prosecutor's office if it's the AM hours or whatever the statute requires. Again, it's not some police state lockdown of the city. This is just us, what we really have done all along, making our officers more aware of it, so that we can document that Johnny Smith was out at 3 a.m., wake the parents up, your child is sneaking out of the house, it's up to the parents to figure out a way to prevent that, right? And then if it happens over and over and over, there's a documentation saying there's a problem here.
So when I was a kid, I remember one night I got pulled over by the state police, and it was my fault. I pulled out in front of them. I almost hit them, and I had some friends in the car or whatever, but it was super late, and I was being a good boy. But, they drove us home. They followed me home and knocked on the door, had to wake my dad up. Dad had to talk to him. Kid's out too late, yada, yada. So even 20, 30 years ago, that was still a thing.
Well, I can tell you, I won't go into my past as a kid. I was busy in school and studying.
Sure.
But hypothetically, if I ever got in trouble, I wasn't worried about the police. I was worried about my dad finding out.
Yeah.
That was the one person I didn't want to find out. So the fear was with my dad and my mom, my parents would do, not necessarily what the criminal justice system would do, hypothetically. So it's just important. Again, we have to be realists here. Okay, you got a 14-year-old kid sneaking out in their TP, and I don't promote that.
Right.
But understanding, using common sense, that's something different than breaking into cars, breaking into businesses.
100%.
At some point, you have to keep the general public safe. And what are we doing? What strategies are we using to keep the general public safe? We had businesses that were vandalized and were stolen from, and so it's a balancing act. And our job is to provide strategies to address those.
How difficult is it? You've been here. You'll be 20 years here in Manistee next year, right? 2014.
19, I think it's 19.
19 years.
I have it right. 19,
and
20.
you have a few officers that are from Manistee in the department. How difficult is it being from where you're policing, especially in a town that's got 6,000 people, a city that's got 6,000 people, versus Muskegon or Grand Rapids, where you're policing, you probably won't pull over somebody necessarily that you know.
I don't know, because I don't work in Muskegon, but I can tell you what I see as a police chief is that when we have things that affect our community, the officers, first of all, all of our officers are committed to the community. They do a great job. But the officers that are from here, it means something extra to them.
Yeah.
Whether it be blight enforcement or someone breaking into cars, it means something extra to them. I can see it, and so that's one of the reasons why my wife and I moved to town from where we were at. I moved as a detective sergeant thinking if I'm to the level where I'm going to serve this community as a detective, I think it's important that I live here. Number one, that I can be responsive and approachable and be able to respond. But if you're going to police the community, I think you should live in it. It's good enough to protect, good enough to live in is what I think.
Right.
And so to answer your question, that I see a little extra from our officers who are from here. That doesn't take anything away from the officers that don't, but you don't have to convince them. So going back to our conversation about Blight, it's not a common thing that police officers are also enforcing Blight. You don't have to convince the officers to live here because, especially ones that live in the city, they see it. They want to address it. You don't have to convince them of the why necessarily. And these other things that come up and will always come up throughout the years, whether it be crime trends or whatever, there's just a little extra commitment, I think, to the public because they are from here. They grew up here. So.
Do we have a crime problem in Manistee?
We don't have a crime. Our crime problem is reflective of the rest of the nation. I can tell you that I'm very happy with, how we've investigated crimes and have solved. Again, I'm not here telling you we're going to solve every crime.
Yep.
No one does anywhere. But what the officers do to reach the expectations, how we treat that now versus years ago, what the expectation is, what effort we're making. And when we have a spike, determining if there's a spike, is that a spike or is that a trend, and developing strategies for that. Every year we have breaking, entering of cars. People steal from cars. And so, this spring as we go to summer, my job is going to be to a little more public education. Very rarely do windows get broken out and theft occurs. It does sometimes,
Sure.
but if you're looking at statistically, very rarely.
It's mostly a doors that's not locked.
That's our job, to put that out in the public, to lock our doors, to keep our property lit up, to keep our driveways lit up, to take away that opportunity. We as police can and do we can to deter that crime through patrols, foot beats, and then when we have reports, work to solve those crimes. But we also have to work with the public to take that opportunity away from criminals, to educate the public and to make them aware so they can lock doors and just take that opportunity away.
Awesome. Thank you.
I appreciate having
it.
me on.
This is awesome.